Hello and welcome to Bring the World Home. This is a production of the Returned Peace Corps Volunteers of Hawaii. My name is Linda Chalk and I will be your host for today's program. I was a Returned Peace Corps volunteer from 1966 to 1968 in the Northern Mariana Islands of Micronesia. With us today we have Jane and Paul Heimerdinger. Welcome.
Thank you, Linda.
Jane
Thank you.
and
Our
Paul.
pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
And they went into the Peace Corps as a couple
Yes.
and served also in the Federated States of Micronesia
Correct.
in the Yap Islands.
On Yap Island.
Right, on Yap Island.
Right.
And we're going to show you, this is Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific, and the Federated States of Micronesia are just east of the Philippines in this area right here, and Yap is closest, I guess, of the 5 island groups closest to the Philippines.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about Yap, what it was like, what the environment is like?
Yap probably is what you might think old traditional Hawaii was like before the missionaries came.
Oh,
With the men wear malos and the women wear grass skirts, and they live off of taro and fish from the sea. And life is very slow and easy, and most days are beautiful and sunny and nice. They live in huts, small little houses, usually raised up off the ground a little bit with a platform. They're really mostly just for sleeping, because the rest of the time you're just outdoors. You don't really stay in your house for anything except in the evening. So they get poles from the forest and they build a frame of a house, and then they cover it with thatch on the roof, and then they weave some sort of pandanus or something, walls for the sides, and just kind of strap that up, and that's their little shelter.
what inspired you to join the Peace Corps? I understand that you were married for about 10 years prior to considering the Peace Corps and applying. Is that right? So what inspired you to?
Well, I think that we were certainly motivated by the Kennedy era and his plea to young people of all ages, really, people of all ages, to rise up and serve the nation. And of course he had a wonderful global perspective on the world, and he knew that we had talents that we could possibly share with people in other parts of the world. So we were very motivated by the Peace Corps, which he started, of course. And also we, were raised in obviously separate families, but both families were service-oriented. So in Paul's household and my household, we were always encouraged to give back and help the communities.
I see. So you did a lot of volunteer work even before the Peace Corps.
We did, yes.
Yeah, it's part of our life.
Worked with handicapped children on a volunteer basis, and we worked for Special Olympics and other things like that.
I see. Was it a fairly long process when you were applying and then going through the different types of reviews, the
Yes,
medical
actually it
background
was kind
checks?
of long. We were given 3 choices. Our first choice was to go to Africa. We had been there on a vacation actually to visit some relatives. Jane's sister was in Kenya. And then we decided on South America as our second choice, and then the Pacific looked wonderful, so we put that down as our third choice.
I see.
But they had a difficult time placing 2 teachers in the same community. So that kind of made the process kind of long. And we had an offer to go to Jamaica, but we decided it wasn't very safe there at that time. And so we declined that offer, and then we got the offer from Micronesia, and we said, well, that's a couple of years in the Pacific sounds wonderful, let's try it. And we haven't regretted it for a second ever since. We knew very little about it. Hadn't even heard of it, of course. It's just a little dot in the ocean.
That's right.
So we had to look it up in National Geographics and those sorts of things to find out something about it before we decided to say yes.
So what kind of training did the Peace Corps offer you? Were you trained back in the United States, or in the host country?
Sure. Well, training actually started in California. We came together with a group of about 130 people who were heading into all parts of Asia, basically the Philippines and so on. And so there was about a week of training there, and I must say that there was a fair amount of dropout at that point. I think as people began to realize that these were somewhat rugged areas that we were being sent into, that they preferred to stay back in the United States, and they could do other things, you know, in their home. And from there, we flew then to Guam, where training continued. There were several days in Guam, and again at that point, more people began to drop out. So, but Paul and I, we were in it for the long haul. We knew we wanted to do this. And so we, at one point, boarded a plane with about 6 other volunteers and headed down into the Micronesian islands. At that time, they called it the island jumper plane because it stopped at all the different islands down the way. Very small plane.
Wow.
And I remember the day that we finally got to Yap, and that we were circling over this island, and the pilot kept saying, now if you look out your left-hand window, you'll see the island of Yap. And the more we looked out, the more we said, well, it's awfully tiny down there. And indeed, it was 10 miles long and 1 mile wide.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's very small.
So a coral atoll.
Atoll,
yeah,
yes.
Atoll.
Yeah.
Sure.
Had a reef, protective reef all the way around, which was wonderful for fishing and very important to their survival, of course. They ate fish every day, almost,
see,
except
wow,
the only
yes.
times when they didn't have fresh fish would be during the rainy season, when the streams would take muddy water out into the ocean. They'd be cloudy and that sort of thing, so fishing was not good, but the rest of the time, fresh fish.
Could you speak English to the natives, or did you have to learn their language?
Well, we certainly
Limited
had to.
English, yeah,
Very
very
limited, yeah. So, but our training continued then on Yap. We were about, I don't know, 6 weeks in training on the island of Yap itself, which included intensive language training and cross-cultural training, of course, which was a very important part of the training.
So you were living with the host family or on your own in Yap?
We were living actually, we were staying at the local high school. In a classroom is where we would sleep at night, and then in other classrooms during the day we would have our language lessons and our cultural lessons, and we ate meals in the cafeteria at that point. So I think the Peace Corps had arranged to hire some cooks and to cook our meals.
And I must say that was our first real introduction to rice and Spam.
Oh.
Yes, plenty of rice and plenty of Spam in training.
And fish?
And fish,
Yes, fish too.
Almost nearly every day, sometimes chicken, and for a celebration some pork. But it's really mostly just fat with a very little bit of meat.
What sort of projects or assignments did the Peace Corps have assigned to you?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was sent as a teacher trainer, and that actually was a very difficult role for me because the society is dominated by the male population, and the female population are considered less capable in many ways.
I see.
And so for a woman to come in and take on a leadership role with men was not the best assignment.
Oh, I see. It made things difficult.
Made things very difficult.
Because of their cultural values.
That's correct, that's correct. But I gave it a try, and you know, it was evident that it really wasn't going to work after about 8 months. I shifted my assignment and took on other responsibilities where I had less interaction with the men.
I see. And more with women then?
And more with women. I worked with the women in gardening. I worked a lot with the children in library. We set up a library in our village.
Yes.
And you did curriculum work?
And I did curriculum work. So more behind the scenes, and then there was just less friction, and actually building from beneath was the best way for me to use my services.
I see. Yes.
And I also wrote a series of books for the young children to use in the early years, and I wrote it in Yapese, their native language.
Really?
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
So that was very exciting. That was a very fun project.
Did you find a sample?
We didn't. We're still looking.
Okay.
But it was quite successful, and they were a series of small books called Bochayat Kobatir, which means some stories for children. So very, obvious and simple title, because it was the first time that they had actually seen things written in their native tongue at the elementary level.
I see. But these were stories that they've heard from their parents and grandparents?
Well, yes. More, I wrote stories about just the everyday life,
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the women working in the garden, preparing baskets of food to take to market, slaughtering pigs at special times of the year. I wrote a story about funerals, one's about weddings. So
documenting their lifestyle.
their lifestyle, right. Very simple vocabulary and illustrated.
And these are for the elementary school
That's
students?
correct, for the elementary school.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
Really.
Thank you.
My role was to replace a teacher who was took time off to do some advanced studying, and then would come back and take over the class again. So actually I did that for 2 years, and they went off island. And
They had a general curriculum like we do here in the United States, or did you
They
tailor it a little?
They maybe had it down on paper, but in what actually happened in the schools was a different thing. These were very remote, small schools. I probably had 12 students or something like that in maybe in those 2 grade levels, and the materials and supplies were very limited, and the equipment in the classrooms was in very poor shape. So we had a light or 2 in the ceiling, but sometimes there was no power, and
my goodness.
And the textbooks were eaten by termites and that sort of thing. So just paper and pencil was kind of a major task to have on hand often.
That's quite a challenge.
Yes. Well, their whole attitude toward education really wasn't very strong, because in order to live off the land, to garden and to fish, you don't really need to have that type of an education in English and history and math and that sort of thing. So it wasn't really recognized by a lot of the people as being an important way to advance your lifestyle or your career, because their lifestyle wasn't going to change very much.
Was there much communication with the outer world besides, just the yap and truck, so, they could really see what else was happening in the world and how an education might benefit them?
No, it really was very limited. They sort of had an idea that all the world is just islands with a lot of ocean around it. And they even had a hard time conceiving large pieces of land like the United States. They thought that the water would just be a short distance away, always. So, and we had no radio. No, sometimes we would listen to Voice of America. We could get that, but that was even difficult for us to pick up on a radio. So, and on the island, there wasn't any television, and there weren't any VCRs and that sort of thing. So it was kind of remote. I don't even remember if we had a newspaper.
No, not unless, it would come in on one of the cargo ships, which came in occasionally.
How often did the ships visit?
It was maybe twice a year. A ship would come in, and that's how the cans of Spam would get in.
I see, my goodness.
And everybody would go down to the dock to meet the ship, and, we would participate and yet, in a way, stand back too and just watch the kind of cargo that came off the ship was not really the cargo that they needed. But
I see.
That's another story.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So besides canned foods and maybe some material, or
it was maybe some building materials, that sort of thing, petrol, that sort of thing. Crackers, cookies, things like that. They ate a lot of ship biscuits there.
Non-perishable.
Right. And I remember we had a terrible hurricane while we were there that just went on for days, and we all went into the mountains, into the caves from the old war to seek protection because our particular village, which was right on the shoreline, was pretty much wiped out. And so the pigs were washed out to sea, chickens, the dogs were washed out. And at any rate, soon after that, the United Nations sent corrugated tin, and I remember when that came in on this ship, and brought out, I don't know, 50 sheets were brought out to our village, and that was a little disheartening because we knew they didn't need corrugated tin. It's very dangerous, it rusts, and it's very hot to use as a roof for those thatched huts. So we were, those kinds of things were disappointing to us, but we...
Westernization was happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So they used the corrugated tin to set up temporary housing, or
They probably
did this
used it
become
for the
permanent?
roof of their houses.
I see.
They also were giving them cement and cinder blocks to start to build cinder block homes that would resist the hurricane. When in fact the houses that they built out of thatch and with poles from the forest could easily be rebuilt.
Yes.
And they were much cooler
Right.
in the evening, and they were very satisfactory for their lifestyle, rather than having a cement floor and cinder block walls, which would make a very hot environment.
Right, or especially the corrugated tin. I know that in the Marianas, when we had a severe hurricane, you could see some of the corrugated roofing wrapped around the trees.
That's right.
Just from
right.
Yeah, because it rips and flies in
Right.
the wind.
Yeah, it's very dangerous. flying.
very dangerous.
And I must say, too, that after strong rainstorms and hurricanes, part of rebuilding the village is part of the important piece of the culture, because that's how children learn to,
Build
to weave the
houses,
palms,
yeah.
weave the
Weave things
houses.
together, lash the poles together to make the coconut rope for all of that. So it's just a part of living
Right.
there and their lifestyle, and they have the time to do all of that. Most people aren't employed. Most people
see.
just live in the village, and they have their gardens where they raise their taro and some other vegetables, not very many vegetables there.
I see.
And they have chickens and maybe a pig, and they have fish. So all the families, the family owns land, and it's much like Hawaii is, where it's a pie slice from the high mountain down to the ocean
I
shore.
see,
So you get a
yes.
variety of land styles where you can have gardens, and others with lowland where you can grow your taro, that sort of thing. And then you
see.
have some ocean coral reef that belongs to your extended family, not just your immediate family. So they tend to live in family compounds on their area, and you fish your own area. You don't fish somebody else's area,
see,
of course,
yes.
without permission and that sort of thing. And when you fish, you bring it back to the village and you share it with your family.
Quite an egalitarian society.
Yes. Yeah.
Paul actually did a lot of night fishing with the
Oh,
gentlemen from
yes.
the village, and they would fish by torches. So during the day they would prepare their torches, and then
Made out of
made out of dried palm frond. They would wrap it around the end of bamboo and soak it in kerosene.
I see.
And head out, after dark, and it was really a lovely sight. The women would stand on the shoreline because the women are really not allowed to go into the ocean. So we would stand on the shoreline and watch the men, in single file, going off into what appeared to be the vast, dark ocean.
It's very dark out there at
Very
night
dark.
without
I
the
see.
moon.
Real.
But they would have these torches, and so you knew that your husband or your son or your brother was the third torch or the fifth torch going out. So you would identify your family member by the placement in that line.
see.
And they would walk out to the reef, which was, quite a ways out in Yap. And then we would sit on the shoreline, batting the mosquitoes and watching for those torches to keep moving along the reef line late at night. And by 2 or 3 in the morning, then you'd see the torches beginning to come in, and you knew the men were
see.
coming
Wow.
back. And so we would wait quietly again on the shoreline, and they would lay all the fish out on the beach, and then it was the women's responsibility that night to clean the fish. So then we would stay up the rest of the night cleaning the fish, and they would.
So the chief or the person whose area you were fishing in usually would distribute amongst the fishing people the fish that they had caught, and then when you bring it home, then the wife is expected to clean
To prepare
the
it,
fish,
right.
prepare it, and by breakfast you would be having, of course, fresh fish
fish,
and
yes.
taro.
Yeah.
And they probably would have to grate the coconut and make the coconut milk and that sort of thing, or maybe breadfruit you might have,
Oh, yes.
and that sort of thing.
Tapioca root.
Tapioca, yeah.
So those are great memories.
How did they catch the fish? Were they using nets or lines?
Sometimes
or
it was a
spears?
net, sometimes it was a throw net.
Uh-huh.
I learned to throw a net. Sometimes it was a gill net where they would stretch a long net out and the fish swim in and get caught by their gills. But most of the time it was spear fishing.
I see.
And they had, actually we would get spear guns. We would go to the local police station, which was about 3 rooms big. And actually the door was open. You could see the prisoners standing at the front door because there was nowhere to run. When you're only 10 miles long and 1 mile wide, they'll catch you anyway.
Okay.
But anyway, the prisoners, to earn extra money, would make these little spear guns, and they would carve them out of wood. And then they would bend a fork and they would put some surgical tubing on it. And that was the power or the force for the spear
elastic,
that you would buy and notch it, and then a clothespin, I think, was even
interesting.
involved in
Yes.
it. And so we would use those spear guns, or they would use the Hawaiian sling
I see.
occasionally, but most of them had these little
So
spear
they just
guns.
fished off of the boats that they were on rather than diving?
Well, rarely did we go on a boat. Most of it was done on bamboo raft, long bamboos that were latched together, and
I
you
see.
pole your way out into the reef, and then you anchor it, and then you just dive off of that raft. The water is not very deep in most areas. It might not be much more than, I don't know, 10, 12 feet deep. And a lot of times you can stand on the coral heads. But they're very good at diving down and holding their breath and staying for a long time. And in the salt water, for me, I didn't weigh very much, but it was very hard to get off the surface of the water and even get down very close.
Right, and also at night it was
Well,
hard to do.
that was
Yeah.
that daytime, but at nighttime was even harder. Yeah, and so it was very interesting, fun. I loved the fishing.
We just have a few minutes. It's gone by so quickly.
gosh,
but
yes.
I noticed that you brought some of the artifacts from Yap and Micronesia. Can you
Right.
tell us a little bit about it?
Probably the most significant, maybe, is the shell money over there.
Okay.
This is
Here?
money that's used in sort of traditional, perhaps, exchanges. You wouldn't go to the store and buy some Spam or corned beef or anything like that using shell money, but you might exchange it in a wedding ceremony or something of that sort, or exchange it perhaps in helping for a canoe and that sort of thing.
Yap is also very well known for this
The
large
stone money,
stone
yes,
monies,
and you probably think that the value is determined by the size of the stone, and that's not correct.
Oh.
It's determined by the adventure that was, or the dangers involved in retrieving that stone.
the story behind.
They had to
That's
right.
sail many miles to a place, I don't know if it was down by
By
New
Palau, I think.
Palau or somewhere, and bring it back on these bamboo rafts or these catamarans
My
that we
goodness,
see
yeah.
like Hawaiian canoes. And sometimes they encountered storms and lost lives and those sorts of things. So that's the story, determines the value.
I see.
And you again would exchange that perhaps for a canoe or something like that, major cultural sort of thing. This is sort of an axe for helping to carve a canoe. They start, of course, with a big log, and they start chipping away the inside and building their canoes.
So they do have
And they
dugout
have
canoes.
dugouts, some dugout
yes.
canoes, but they're not used very often.
I see.
They're much harder to get in and out of the water, and the rafts, 2 people can easily carry them and put them in and out of the water. And they keep them close to the shore, but the canoes, they need a canoe house with a thatched roof to protect it from
Yes.
the sun and
Right.
keep it dry.
Maybe you have the chart over there.
Oh, and we have an ocean chart here. Actually goes this way. And this is made out of bamboo and little cowrie shells. And the shells represent atolls or islands, and the different bamboo strips represent different currents and things. And the navigators used to navigate by the stars, and they would put a coconut shell with water in the canoe so they didn't have to look up all the time, and they could see the reflection of the stars in the coconut shell. And they were quite good at navigating the ocean in their sailboats and canoes.
This is a hair decorative piece for the hair that the men and women would wear, especially in celebrations and dances.
I see.
Yeah.
And this is a little holder for gubui. It's the leaf that you wrap the betel nut in.
Oh, yes.
And so you would keep your green ivy leaves in here. And I had a little container, I don't know where it's gone, that had the lime in it. And we chewed betel nut for a couple of years, and actually chewing tobacco with it. Actually, we had red teeth.
and
We did.
everything.
Our dentist had a fit when we got back.
Well,
Very
this has
good
been very interesting, and I want to thank you both very much,
You're very
Jane.
welcome. Yeah, thank you
And
for the
Paul.
opportunity. You
Thank
brought
you
back
so
good memories.
Mine too.
Yeah,
Good.
And we want to thank you so much for joining us on Bring the World Home. And to our audience, I hope that this sharing of an experience of both returned Peace Corps volunteers here has given you some inspiration for possibly joining the Peace Corps.
Absolutely.
right.
Check
Yeah.
out our website, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much.